Hi, I'm James McGuire, editor of Datamation, and our topic today is what's wrong with big data? Why isn't it perfect yet? Why isn't it as simple and fast as we'd like it to be? To talk about that, we've got three great experts. With us is Valentino Tereshko, technical program manager for big data at Google. Hello to you, Tino.
Hello.
You are there at the Googleplex today, correct?
Oh, I'm actually in Seattle right now.
You're in Seattle. Okay, so you never see Sergey walking down the halls ever.
I see a lot of Sundar, not so much Sergey.
Oh, okay, interesting. Also with us is Satyen Sangani, CEO of Alation. Hello to you, Satyen.
Hi, James. It's great to be here.
So give us the little 11-second elevator pitch. What does Alation do? I know that the tagline is Yelp for big data, but what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's relatively similar to Yelp or LinkedIn or Amazon or even to a certain extent Google. I think all of those are systems that allow you to understand a certain class of information. We help people inside of companies understand the data and the systems of data inside of their companies. And so, like Google, we crawl and scan those systems, and we look for what people are doing with the data and use that information, use that human activity trail to build a very, very rich catalog that people can update collaboratively, socially, and ask questions around. And why that's useful and relevant is because the world's only getting to be a more complex place. And so as analysts inside of companies try to mine more and more information for profit, getting to that information faster and more easily with context is the next critical problem.
Sounds good. Also with us is Mr. Mike Matchett, analyst with the Taneja Group, all-around smart person. How are you doing, Mike?
Oh, good today. Good today. Thanks, James.
I know that you and I have done some deep dives with Hadoop and big data, so you're definitely one of the go-to people when it comes to big data. So the question is, what is the friction involved with big data? When you think about, it is sort of promised as this fairy dust. We're going to, sprinkle this fairy dust over our difficult questions. That our big data solution was going to give us these gleaming insights of information. We're all going to go off and earn $1 zillion with this great data. It hasn't always worked out that way. There's been a certain amount of confusion, even some backlash. So what is the friction all about? In other words, how can we get more people using more data faster? Satyen, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the promise of BI is really, very basic. People get these insights, and insights help you understand the true nature of a thing. That's sort of the definition of the term. And if you think about this notion of insight, it's really relevant to, you've got to have the right information with the right context, for the right person in the right moment. One person's insight is another person's learned fact 20 years ago, and another person's insight is something that somebody won't understand for another 20 years. And so having the right bit of data at the right points in time is really the critical thing. I think the problem is that the translation effort around understanding, mining, visualizing, and really just getting your hands around the data is itself a real problem. Data is built by computer systems. Computer systems are built by programmers using some very complicated algorithms and abstractions. And fundamentally, to get acquainted with the data, you have to understand where it came from, how it was produced, who's worked with it, what questions it can possibly answer. And all this stuff takes a lot of time, no different from somebody researching something in a library and trying to read up on it. It takes a lot of time. And so I think what we find is that people would love to get more insights, and nobody says that they want to be less insightful. But the reality is that there's only so much time in a day, and most people can't spend the time it takes to gather the knowledge to start developing these insights arbitrarily. And so for us to sort of build this kind of data-driven world that's going to make us these zillions of dollars that everybody has promised, I think there's a auxiliary reality that is that people have to figure out a way to lower the cost of learning about the data, to learn from the data.
You said it's lowered cost, and there's also a time factor, I think I heard in there as well. So it's a question of just letting the time pass, or us evolving and finding a lower cost solution?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, if you think about it, data, like, anything else has well, not like anything else, but like any information asset, has a half-life. If you know what your customer is about to buy before they're going to buy it, that's really great. If you know about it 2 seconds after they make the purchase, not super useful. And so the cost of information is one piece of it, and lowering that cost then presumably makes it faster and easier for you to get to that information. But you got to do both. If you don't have it just in time, in the right place, in the right form, not useful. Just opportunity goes away.
Tina, what's your view? How do we make this easier, and how do we eliminate some of the innate confusion involved with big data?
Well, I mostly agree with Satyen's points. Really, big data is difficult for three reasons. The current technology spectrum of big data is very, very expensive and very complex to leverage. It requires a lot of specialized talent that you may not have in your company and in your enterprise. And of course, big data carries a lot of uncertainty when it comes to value. Right? Folks think that they should have big data projects going on in their companies, but not always do they know what exactly that will mean in terms of value. Google has long been has a tradition of hiring really smart people and giving them very, very easy tooling to create numerous hypotheses and test them and reject them as quickly as possible. And so Google Cloud Platform is really the externalization of Google's tooling. And we feel like we have a really good story around giving folks tooling that allows them to operate at a really massive big data scale without the complexity and without the tinkering that is associated with traditional big data technologies.
But if you would advise some theoretical company out there who may or may not be using the Google solution, who may be, what would you say? Is there some way we can make this a little easier than it already is? What is there a simple answer to that incredibly complex question?
Of course, I think the goal should be to maximize the ability to iterate on big data, to experiment with big data. Right? Mm-hmm. That should be the goal. And a lot of companies don't have the core competency that surrounds a lot of big data projects. So if you go
into in-house data scientists? Is that when you say core competency, you mean in-house data scientists, or not necessarily?
That's one example. When it comes to building big data projects on premise, for example, a lot of companies, their core competency is not building data centers, right? And so that is one distraction that a lot of companies fall into when they start their big data projects. They try to do it on premise, and there is a lot of overhead, a lot of time that requires before you're able to iterate on big data if you start on premise. So generally, and Gartner agrees with us, we propose that maybe once your big data project is mature, you can put it on premise. But to start to iterate on your big data, you should start in the cloud.
Mike, how do we cut through the friction? I mean, there's sort of an obstacle between us and the answers. How do we limit that obstacle for big data?
Oh, I get to solve the problem, right?
This is it. I mean, when it all comes down to it, we're looking to you, Mr. Matchett, for the answer.
Whatever you say.
Well, I mean, I think just to step back a bit, the way I kind of look at the problem is, it's hard to jump into big data and just mess around and get anywhere. And I think what a lot of folks that you mentioned have gotten a little disappointed with is they say, hey, it seems like a good idea. We've got a lot of data, I think. Let's just go mine it and pull the value out of it and build something in the back room and run with it. And that's really not going to get you anywhere good. And part of the problem is, as we've just already mentioned, it's a skills problem. You have to be able to approach these new. You got business analysts who understand how to look at data. They look at the data warehouse all the time. They look at the business intelligence. They want to make strategic decisions. But then they jump over and try to take those same skills to a big data set where you're really looking to say, hey, I want to do machine learning. I want to do predictive things. I want to impact operations in real time. And it's a little different way of looking at the world, and the different sets of data might be involved, and different architectures certainly. That they're not, IT certainly is not used to dealing with. I think that gives you some really big challenges right there. And at the same time, there's these enterprise IT requirements that everyone forgets about. So they go off and they build their big data project in a clean room, and then they go to put it in production. They realize, hey, wait a minute, what about security? What about data validation? What about quality, data quality? What about disaster recovery? What about all this other stuff? I think that really throws a monkey wrench into ultimately getting the real value out of as referred to as a big data project. At the same time, I see things, as been mentioned, there's definitely ways to approach this to take some of that burden off of the rank and file company or community, and one of them is to use a service provider like Google or the number of. I'll give you guys a credit here. There's a number of service providers that do that.
You get a free Google search, Mike, for that.
I get a free Google. I get a free ad placement maybe if I.
Okay. All right.
and there are tools now that can be brought to bear to track the data and to secure the data, scrub the data, keep credit cards out of it, and so on, so that you're not mashing up personally identifying information unknowingly. And I think the ecosystem's evolving really rapidly in that direction. So I think we're going to see good things coming out of the next year. At all the big data shows I've been to this year, it's finally been focused on security, which is, to me, a sign of maturity in the market. So you generally have to talk about performance first, which is what Hadoop was all about and MapReduce to start with. And then you talk about availability, which is what all the distros were about. Like, how do we make this system actually work and stay available? And now we're talking about security finally. It's like, how do I secure that data and protect it and bring it into production environments? So I really see the next year as something where a lot of people start to really, in bulk, get past that disappointment and into really recognizing value.
Interesting on the security point. I think it's one of the headaches the companies think about. First of all, who has access to all the data? Who are the sysadmins who have access to all this data? Can it be hacked? I mean, Tino, is that one of the things? I mean, if a company is worried about security with big data, what would you say to them?
That's a really interesting point. When you think about security, when you think about all the recent hacks that have occurred, I will say a lot of those hacks have occurred because a company has made a decision to own the security story. I think it makes a lot of sense to partner with companies who can leverage economies of scale to provide a security story, who are vested in providing security for hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of customers. And which is why you see a lot of public cloud providers. Folks are starting to kind of realize that public cloud is not as secure as private cloud is not necessarily true. And as Mike was saying, that's kind of what we're facing, right? With big data and with public cloud merging together, the security story emerges.
Mm-hmm. Satyen, your take on security, that's sort of the nightmare of security and big data. Like, how do you? There's some IT executive out there who's extremely anxious about the idea of when the idea of security gets mixed with the idea of big data, that makes them really nervous. I mean, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really tough. I mean, if you look at the Ashley Madison scandal that just happened, right? That's the most recent one. It's really scary. I mean, on one hand, I think that all of us have a little sympathy for people who are, potentially philanderers and looking for people to cheat with on the web. And on the flip, there's probably a whole bunch of people who are on that website who really are maybe not, have done nothing and possibly are getting accused based on intention. And it's mining this intention data that's really interesting, because now we're able to, through all of this data, get inside people's brains and get inside of their heads. And I think that puts a huge responsibility on the people who are consuming this data about how to use it, who's using it. And I don't think these are just technical problems, right? It's not just about securing the data itself. It's about being able to make sure that the appropriate people inside the institution are able to see what the rules are around how to use it, around what could be done with this data, being able to warn people and empower people with the appropriate knowledge.
You're talking about privacy issues, almost like a big brother issue with big data?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is a huge set of responsibilities that come up socially around training people to learn how to use the data and when to use the data and where to use the data better. And I don't know that that's just about sort of locking down and assigning roles and rights and privileges. I think there are technical solutions, but I think the more difficult solutions that if you're a CIO you have to face are, what do I do about these insiders who have access to the data who may be a threat? What happens if somebody figures out an innovative use, as Target did, around predicting whether or not somebody's going to have a baby, and do we send them a mailer? And how do we think about these problems internally, and how do we make sure that those don't threaten our business? And I think those are really the ones that are much more profound, and I think the ones that are much more difficult to contend with. And I think we see that all the time with our customers, because a lot of what we do is help customers broaden the use of data inside of their enterprises. And the biggest question becomes, well, if we're going to broaden the use of all this information, how do we make sure that we're doing it in a responsible way? And how do we empower people with knowledge that maybe they should only have contextually or only have in a certain particular way? And so the security challenges, I think, don't go away by any extent. I think they just get worse and worse over time, because as you give people more knowledge, you give them more ability to do harm.
Right. I mean, the target issue you bring up, where apparently based on shopping patterns, the target in theory knows whether the family member may or may not be pregnant. Obviously, it does create an enormously sensitive issue. I mean, does Target or some retailer then begin sending mailers to the house? I mean, what is, or sort of like there's the big data solution, and there's some very very human issues about how that solution gets used.
Yeah.
Mr. Matchett, what's your take on security and big data? Is there any way to lessen the headache there?
Yeah, well, so just to follow up on that, so I saw that there was, the conversation descending in 3 levels, and security at one level being about making sure you've got the data under lock and key, and that can include adhering to laws, like making sure you don't repatriate some data that's supposed to stay in one country versus another country. At a second level, you've got regulation and compliance issues, which is again still sort of laws enforced, but to say, I won't, even though I'm allowed to have credit cards as a company, I won't store them or use them in certain ways, and I have to protect those from being accessed by certain members of my organization that might not use them in the right way or prevent them from leaking. And then you've got what Satyen brought up, which is intent, which is minority report kind of stuff. Like I can mash up all this data, and now maybe I'm getting to the point where I'm not just finding out what someone's already done, but what they might intend to do, and should I leverage that or not? And and I think the rule has to be more than simply, will I be embarrassed if I do it this way, which seems to be what most people are talking about now. I find out someone's pregnant, and I target them with what Target did actually, right? So it was then that very directed advertising, which got everyone into an uproar. And what they decided to do instead is now bury that inside other advertising and blend it in so it's not noticeable, not objectionable. But they're still
using. That's a tricky solution to the problem.
But they're still using that data that way. They never said they were going to stop doing that. In fact, they still exploit that intention. They just do it in a way that's not straight line A to B. So I think the moral issue goes deeper. It's like, should they be doing that? Should we be allowing them that? And is privacy information on that? But we certainly can't solve that today. I would say that there's a lot of value to be mined out of big data that doesn't go into those gray areas, that can be about company performance or operational improvement or predictive scoring on which action should the company take themselves to be more optimal in their business processes. And for a lot of companies, they're probably safer in those areas than they are in dealing with client and external third-party information. I think that's a real sensitive area that has yet to be worked out.
What about the people who say, if you ask them, how do I make big data simple? They'll give you the one of two answers. One would be, well, you want to be in a cloud-based solution, then that really solves all your problems. Or the other side says, oh, it's got to be on-prem because, of course, all your data is on-prem. So does a cloud-based solution or an on-prem solution necessarily solve your headaches when it comes to big data? Is one clearly and obviously better? Something your take on that?
I mean, I think it largely depends on who you are as a company and where you are in your maturity cycle. I think that as the cloud matures, and as you've got amazing entrants like Google and of course there's Amazon, who are incredibly sophisticated about managing infrastructure, it makes less and less sense if you're a small company, a medium-sized company, and probably soon if you're a large multinational, to start managing that infrastructure on your own. I mean, Google now manages email for very, very large Fortune 500 clients, and there's no reason why they shouldn't manage the infrastructure for very large data centers where you're processing and managing a lot of big data. So I do think that as time evolves, the infrastructure and the cloud providers will grow up so that the cost of moving the data around is not as high, and the infrastructure cost is relatively lower than one could build in-house. That would seem to make sense. Whether we're there or not today, I don't know. I think it really largely depends on the use cases, and my guess is that Tino could probably have a much more view on that in particular. So I think data is going to, but largely I think data is going to exist in a lot of different places. I mean, I think we live in a multi sort of lots of hybrid environment. I mean, there's companies that have stuff on cloud, and there's companies that will have stuff on premise, and most companies have both. And you're going to find data is going to move into and out of each sense for a long time. And so I don't see that largely changing anytime soon. Perhaps over the long run it will move to the cloud.
Tino, I sense you have an opinion about whether or not a cloud-based solution or an on-prem solution is better. And I guess as part of my question, I would ask you, like, What about that salesperson who's on the way to a sales call, and her region is a Southwest region. She wants to ask a really fast query from her smartphone app, and she needs an answer like in the next 11 seconds. Is that? I mean, what happens when you're a cloud-based big data environment in that sort of situation?
So, of course, I'm a little biased because I work for Google Cloud. The one parallel I like to draw between the private and public clouds is the banking industry. Right? Before banks came around thousands of years ago, you had to keep money in your own home, right? And if you had lots of money, you had to build a fence around your home, and you had to dig a trench, and you had to provide security and so forth. But then through economies of scale, this central location that is vested in the security of your money, that has economies of scale, allows you to do much more with it, right? But there's still room for a lot of folks to have that safe at home, to keep their family jewels, and to keep a lot of cash in there. So I think I agree with Satyen. There's going to be, private cloud will never go away. There's always going to be room for private cloud. In the context of big data, the public cloud allows you to operate at scale without having to do lots of investments, without committing a lot of time and effort, right? So that time to iteration and time to value decreases greatly in public cloud. And of course, with the next generation cloud-native products like BigQuery product that I'm working on, you're able to do some incredible things. And one example, of course, is with BigQuery, the ability to scale from 0 cores to 9,000 cores for 11 seconds to generate a terabyte-sized SQL query, and then scale down and only pay for those 9,000 cores for those 11 seconds. This is absolutely impossible anywhere else outside of cloud. Right?
But what about the speed issue for that theoretical, salesperson on their way to a call, and there is actually just a very bottom level big data query?
Yeah.
Is that going to work? Is there still a speed issue for that person, or not necessarily, in your view?
Well, I think you can replicate speeds if performance is what you're after. You can duplicate performance, whether it's in your private cloud or in the public cloud. But when you intersect performance with cost, with time to market, it's an equation with a lot of variables, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that equation overall is much more attractive in the public cloud. Now, of course, there's companies like Etsy who have moved off of the public cloud into back their own data centers because they have a very predictable analytics platform. They know exactly what's going on. They know exactly what they're building. They're very comfortable with it. It's a very static workload, and they're very comfortable running their own technologies. They consider it their core competency.
I've always wondered about those companies that have that attitude. How can they say to themselves, we have a very stable environment? I mean, what's going to happen 36 months from now? I mean, really? There's such a thing as business stability, especially for a business that's online? But, well, okay, that's a different question.
I think it's a fundamental question to analytics. I mean, it's funny. I think that everybody, the old world of business intelligence was, I wait 2 years, I ask a set of questions that I want to have answered through a set of dashboards, and I wait 2 years for those dashboards to get developed. And I think precisely to your point, a stable analytics environment is sort of in some sense an oxymoron, because, I mean, the entire purpose of analytics is to ask more questions and to learn so that you can ask even more questions. And so, by definition, in some sense, you're constantly going to change. And I think one of the big complaints about data warehousing is, well, it doesn't answer my questions that it would have otherwise answered 18 months ago. And the reality is that should be true because your organization is learning, and the same data warehouse ought to be evolving. And so, whether you're using Google or we've got partners at Altiscale who handle a lot of the infrastructure-oriented challenges. I think the reality is that you've got to that managing the infrastructure is one problem. Managing the human process of asking questions is another problem, and they are different problems at different levels. To Mike's exact point, and we see that all the time. And I think CIOs are really concerned with the infrastructure problem, and we see business people very much concerned with the human process of asking questions.
How does that relate? Just so is that relate to the cloud and on-premise thing, or is it almost a separate issue?
I think they're two separate issues. I think that there's a it's a question of look, I want to buy a product. Now, do I buy it online? Do I buy it in the store? There are different reasons for which you would want to do one thing. And then there's the question of which product am I buying? Well, am I going to buy this TV or that TV? And how do I select which TV we're going to be buying? And how do I figure out the analysis to determine which is the right TV? And those are two different problems at two different levels. You might want to buy the same thing online as you might want to do in the store, or you might want to buy something totally different, and there are different decision points, really, for a company to make.
Mike, are you an on-premise advocate, or are you totally a cloud guy when it comes to big data?
Well, you can almost guess my answer is going to be hybrid, James. So, which is
maybe hybrid is really the only answer to that question, really. But
yeah, it's the practical. Yeah. It's the practical thing, and that's what we see happening outside of big data, just in cloud infrastructure in general, or any kind of clustered architecture. Is you have a baseline cost for your stable workload, as you pointed out, and that's probably going to end up on premise in the long run if someone has the ability to do that just for cost. And then you have the unknown part, the variable part, the new part, the ability to do research and development, ask new questions, burst on some seasonality or cycles into a cloud. So, I think it's a hybrid. It's going to be a hybrid world of some kind, which is a half and half answer. But enabling that has been difficult for some time because of big data. It's big. It's you have to make sure you can secure it in both places now. You don't want to replicate it and pay for storage in both places. You do have to be on top of your game to do a hybrid solution of any kind. I think we talked about security before, but I just want to throw out the idea of encryption as being a really key enabler of this, and being able to secure your data wherever it is. But at the end of the day, I think people who say that service providers aren't as secure as on-premise are fooling themselves.
It's one of the ironies, really, because those remote service providers, their entire business is based on being secure. And if you look at all the headlines, everyone's who's been breached, it's like actually public is safer than in-house.
I'm completely in that camp. If you look at the fact that, and I'm sure Dino can throw in some stats here, but the breaches are almost always, and even this goes back to who steals from the secrets from the government, not just Ashley Madison, but it's always human based. It's a human factor problem most of the time, and in your data center, those are employees that can get disgruntled. In the public cloud, they don't know you from A to Z. You're
right.
And as long as you can create the isolation, if you can encrypt your data and keep it from mingling, keep it from leaking on there. I mean, you look at the data center. I've walked into data centers. I think we talked about this one time, where people have the door propped open with a chair and a fan sitting on it, and a cord from the fan running over there. It's like, don't trip on the fan because below the circuit breaker, which will shut down the server.
Also,
and the kind of stretch here and going like, what? This is not secure. And so, oh yeah, this secretary.
It's also the password is written on a sticky note above the screen too.
And so you don't see. I mean, you go to any qualified service provider location, and you're going to see, if not tank traps, you're going to see ditches. You can't even drive a truck up next to the building, and it goes from there, right? It's just a different environment entirely. So, yeah.
What about, and I think about things that limit big data. I think it's one of the ironies is that it's very hard to get the human element out of big data, and that we have these solutions, but we ourselves, we humans, are contextualizing the hypotheses. We're getting the insights back. We're getting a series of answers back. We've got to decide which of those answers is real or not. Isn't it kind of one of the ironies of big data is that the human element to that is as important as ever? Do you know your take on that?
I think I definitely agree with you, at least at the current state of big data. Of course, there are some really interesting things going on in the DeepMind labs that are self-educating processes. But overall, human element is as important as ever, because and it has the prevalence of SQL, right? You have to have people who define the hypotheses, like you said. You have to have people who propose the questions, and then ask those questions, and then define what the questions are. And this is why big data is so hard to deal with, because it's very hard to ask those questions with a lot of current technologies. It's very hard to iterate on those questions. And so I think any big data expert should focus on offer its human element the best tools to iterate as quickly as possible, right? Whether that's SQL, whether that's programming languages, and so forth. I think that's really important.
Maybe it's also up to us as human beings. I mean, sometimes I think part of the problem is accepting the answers we get. I mean, maybe it's a very counterintuitive answer. Sometimes the data knows a lot that we don't know. We almost don't want to think that way. Satyen, what do you run into with this sort of human big data conflict here? Is there a side you take on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think data is just at the end of the day a means, right? I mean, it's just another source of information. It's a source of information that's produced by computers, but I think its promise is that it lacks bias, right? That unlike other sources of information, an article on the web, this webcast, theoretically everything has some element of bias, and data is this thing that's just pure observation, purely seeing what other things have recorded, and that's wonderful and great. I think that what we need is to make that source of information much more accessible so that you can validate the hypotheses that Tino's referring to, so that you can actually get in front of an idea and say, look, I can go gather the data to be able to get it. And I don't think these ideas are as complicated as most people consider them to be, but I think the steps that you have to take in order to get the right data are themselves complicated, so there's a fatigue factor. Then most people don't have the intellectual sort of marathon capability to go through and stand up a server and get data put into that server and then build a schema and then build some aggregates and then build an algorithm. I mean, all that stuff takes a lot of work and takes a lot of time, and too many experts have to participate in that process. And so I think the real human problem is how do you coordinate people so that the knowledge is available just in time? We spend our time thinking a lot about that there's a lot of embedded knowledge inside of companies. And really the big challenge is how do you surface that big embedded knowledge, whether it's in a Google Cloud system, in a Teradata install, in somebody's head. How do you get that in front of somebody? Then that's sort of why we exist.
Mm-hmm. Mike, what do you think? Human versus big data, is there a winner there? In the Hell 9000, I think that the astronauts were jetting out of space. That famous line, "Sorry, Dave, I can't do that, Dave." So far ahead of its time.
I'm thinking back to the Industrial Revolution and the Luddites and so on, and the John Henry with his hammer versus the steam drill.
Right. I think the steam drill won in that one, if I remember.
Yeah.
Okay.
Certainly remove more coke and iron. But the whole point of big data, the whole point, as Satyen was getting at, and I think, is that you're mining it to get some value to make an informed decision. You want to create a more aligned strategy. You want to work in a context today with some knowledge of future events, some prediction of future scenarios or events. So it's not really one or the other. You still have to take that data and use it in order for it to have value. And I'm thinking maybe we need a new metric. It's not time to value or time to that. So.
Do we lose you, Mike? The Hell 9000. Oh, there you are. Okay.
So heard me. Okay.
You're talking about a new metric. I'm fascinated to know what the new metric is.
Time to intelligence rather than time to value or time to install. Right. It's the time it takes to get to the point where you've actually incorporated the result into some actionable thing and realize some return on your investment. Right. That's I think what it's not really an either or question, right? You're trying to harness all this technology and data science and everything to help some human at some point do something better.
Mm-hmm. What about if the three of you put on your sort of your you look at your crystal balls and think, what's going to be happening with this 3 to 5 years from now? Will we look back and think, gosh, the idea that there was any confusion or complication with big data, what a quaint idea, we've come so far from that? Or what are we going to be thinking about in terms of big data, say 3 to 5 years from now? Tino, what's your take on that?
I think the holistic intelligence is in gathering everything that's possibly can be gathered, whether it's a website, every single click, whether it's IoT, every single thing that happens around every single device. I think that really is going to go mainstream because you've seen companies like the Google acquisition Nest that essentially transformed an industry that hasn't changed in almost 100 years, right? Which is the ability to holistically understand what's going on. And so more and more companies are starting to figuring out that holistic data gathering, just being greedy with data collection, and being able to experiment with that data and to loop that data analytics back into product is really going to differentiate these companies. And as more and more companies are getting into that space, the more and more companies embrace that level of thinking, the companies that are not doing that are going to be in a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, I think about what you said reminds me of the Waze app that incorporates, it's like social media and traffic, so it's all a loop. The information is a real-time loop that is helping drivers, who would then turn put more information in. So it's the information almost feeds on itself in a real-time loop.
Yep.
Satyen, your sense of 5 years out, big data, where are we going with all this?
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about this theme of sort of everybody being an analyst. I mean, if we think about kind of a lot of the evolutions with software, whether it's the spreadsheet that made everybody sort of capable of being a financial analyst, or if you think about things like Adobe Photoshop and everybody being sort of a photographic editor, I think we think that there's sort of this notion that to do your job, you will have to effectively become a data analyst. And in a world where data is a fundamental part of decision making and a fundamental part of how you think about what you do, that's going to tax the systems to be significantly easier, significantly more transparent. And there's going to be a large element of collaboration that's involved in this, because being able to validate things and test your hypotheses in part have to do with sort of dealing with data and mining the data and figuring out what the distribution looks like, but it's also about talking to your colleagues and figuring out that you're coming up with the right hypotheses. And so, we see a lot around sort of broadening the skill set around who can become an analyst. I think decrypting the data scientist is something that's going to happen by and large, because ideally anybody who has a hypothesis should be able to, as you might at Google, sort of test it and validate it. And then beyond that, I think we see sort of a world where the tooling is going to get just simpler and simpler. So I don't think we're, the technologies that exist today are only going to get stronger, and I think we're going to see more and more technology, really to the point it's kind of the Moore's Law. I mean, I think it's just going to become, more scalably easy to test the hypothesis to assemble an insight.
Yeah, it reminds me, I saw this video recently of Gartner and the Gartner research firm, and they were talking about they had taken big data off of their hype cycle, because big data is being broken up and is being incorporated into so many different elements that it is standalone, but it's also incorporated so many elements. It's not totally standalone, and it's sort of on the flip side of that is what you're saying is we all need to be data scientists. There isn't just a small tribe of people known as data scientists. In the future, many more of us will need to be data scientists.
Yeah.
Please go on. Yeah.
I think Mike's point, I mean, there's this notion of sort of, he was thinking, I think time to, I'd say time to insight is the appropriate metric, and I think in a world where if there is only a small amount of data scientists, that's a pretty sad world that we live in. I think that, I think there are visions of the world where they're controlled by computers, there are visions of the world that are controlled by humans, and I think we've just got to make more people smarter in order to get to the world that I think we all ideally live in.
Mike, are you ready to make more people smarter? Where are we going 5 years from now?
It's, again, torn a little bit. I mean, I see great strides in machine learning coming down to the masses. Things where you can push a button and it'll tell you what the best algorithm it is to use on your data set, and what patterns can be found in there before you even think to ask the question, which is some very interesting stuff, and the data is getting bigger. At the same time, I see the Internet of Things coming along, as you mentioned, Nest, and some other stuff. When everything's producing data, there's going to be still a lot more data than what we think of as big today. And so there's going to be this race, I think, in scale. And it's possible that the service providers like Google are going to prevail here simply because of that explosion in scale. There's no way people can do it on premise, and so that's a good bet there for Google. But I'd like to say that big data is really only going to be successful not just when Gartner drops it, but when we don't think of big data as big. We just think of that as data analysis. Of course, it's large, and we have that under our tool belt as a matter of course. And I go into Excel, and my Excel spreadsheet connects to some cloud data bank, and whatever I'm doing there is working on big data with the same simplicity. So.
I want to have Hadoop on my smartphone. Is that coming soon? Or some Hadoop front-facing app. At any rate, I appreciate this.
I'm sure you can get it to Google with your smartphone, and I'm sure that'll work.
You think that's possible? Okay, I'll try that.
Hadoop with friends.
Thank you very much for your expertise, the three of you. It was great. I certainly learned something, and I will send you the link, and we can all tweet it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank
All
you,
right.
guys.
Thanks.